Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'd like to continue with the program. The next session is going to focus on mainstream media's subservience to the Democrat Party. Very pleased to introduce two gentlemen who will make excellent presentations for us today. We have Jesse Franklin-Murdock, a counselor at Dhillon Law Group in California, and Bryan Blehm, founder of Blehm Law. Bryan's been very active with the Kerry Lake issues and has some firsthand fortunate experience with lawfare. Jesse Franklin-Murdock spoke to us during our Get Trump conference and made an excellent presentation on the Jean Carroll case. So they're great speakers. So I think we have it that Jesse will start the presentation, followed by Bryan.
All right. Well, thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this presentation today. I had a great time at the last one, and it's an honor to be back. So as David mentioned, I am a lawyer at Dhillon Law Group in San Francisco. We do all sorts of litigation related to political issues, constitutional issues. So the types of topics that David's organization presents on are really close to the work we do, and I think it's really important. So as David mentioned, I'm going to speak about the media's subservience to the Democrat Party and really kind of backward looking how I think that sort of come about and changed in recent years, and in a forward looking way, how I see it as affecting the election that's presently taking place. So just to frame all this, I want to give a statistic I found a few weeks ago that I thought was really striking. The Media Research Center published an article, I think it was on August 19th, that did an analysis of the major cable news networks' coverage of the election. And they found that on a quantitative level, Harris received 66% more coverage than Trump, and that her coverage was 84% positive, while Trump's was 89% negative. So when you put this in numerical terms and think of how this translates to the median voter, if somebody watches, let's say, 2 hours of news a week, which is probably on the high side, but on an election year, I think that'd be a reasonable estimate as far as just your typical voter. So if they watch 2 hours of news a week, that means that they might hear about 75 minutes of Harris coverage and 45 minutes of Trump coverage. The Harris coverage would then be 63 minutes of positive coverage and just 12 minutes of negative coverage. Then, with the 45 minutes of Trump coverage, you get 40 minutes of negative and 5 minutes of positive. And when you think of it in those four categories, that itself is indicative of major bias. It means that you're going to be bombarded with pro-Harris propaganda and anti-Trump propaganda, and hearing just a few little clips of something that might balance out those two overwhelming perspectives. So because of that, we cannot really count on the media to be a truth-telling organ, an organ of accountability, or really an organization or a body collectively that fosters the kind of free speech that the First Amendment is meant to protect, but really a wing of the Democrat Party. So today I want to give a few thoughts on why I think that's come about, how it manifests, and then specifically how is that taking place in the election that's currently going on. So here are some thoughts on why, and there's a lot of thoughts out there on how this has happened and the cultural factors, the political factors, etc. But I want to give one sort of specific perspective that is about social media. And I think that there are social dynamics driving what the incentives are for journalists, both professionally and socially, that have really driven them to abandon their role as truth tellers and embrace a role as party activists who happen to work for these major media companies. So I don't accept the view necessarily that a journalist with political views of his or her own is by nature unreliable or unethical. I think there are fantastic journalists who do hard-hitting investigative work that may have perspectives on either side of the aisle. Being a good reporter is about being well-sourced, being diligent, and following the facts where they take you. And I think you can still do that with a political perspective. So there's always been a bias, and it's usually been a left-wing bias, but something has changed in recent years. And that something, I would argue, is social media. At a certain point, journalists were expected to maintain personal social media presences and ultimately become a brand of their own if they wanted to build a name for themselves and stay relevant, increasingly in an age where the news business is not a profitable business for most media organizations. A journalist whose work consists only of their reported pieces will almost invariably have less relevance and influence than someone who participates in, or even better, drives the discussion on social media. A good example of this would be Taylor Lorenz, who, at the time I was preparing this presentation, was on leave at the Washington Post. In the last few days now, we know that she's been either dismissed or left the paper and has now gone independent. And the reason why she's become one of the most famous or notorious journalists in America is not because of her hard-hitting reporting, her investigative work, anything like that. It's really just because she has become a master of rage bait on social media, who will post something about her avocado toast or her views on masks or something like that, and suddenly everyone from the far extremes of Twitter and its competitors to Fox News is talking about it. So really driving engagement bait is a way that journalists can build a name for themselves, which creates incentives that are different from just trying to get ahead through the quality of your reporting. So on social media, given that the people that in the pre-Elon days were really almost universally left-wing, in order to be in good standing among the kind of tastemakers and cultural elites, you really had to, number one, have a social media presence, and number two, have that social media presence be overwhelmingly liberal. So this creates a dynamic where the social incentive for journalists is not simply to do good reporting and maybe share their articles on social media, but to act as raging partisans who police dissenting views through high school bullying tactics, such as the pylon that we inevitably see when somebody steps out of line, does a piece that is critical of the Democrat Party, or expresses a view that is really contrary to the narrative that we're all supposed to believe. A good example would be the recent uproar over Olivia Nuzzi, the New York Magazine's reporter. Now, she was really one of the only journalists in center-left media to tell the truth about Biden's cognitive disintegration before he dropped out of the race. Anyone with a brain, of course, could tell long before the debate in June that something was wrong with Biden. But the media line was that these were deep fakes or cheap fakes and a right-wing conspiracy theory. Now, Olivia Nuzzi took a different approach, and she actually talked to sources, examined Biden in his public appearances, and reported before it was the common line and acceptable that something was wrong with him. And what has happened to her since is that there's been a ruthless campaign into her personal life, which may be newsworthy. I think that's debatable. But the way that it's been reported without really any factual investigative work underlying it, but really just sort of the rumor mill and the eagerness with which Democrat media personalities dropped everything they were doing to really go through these sordid rumors and allegations about her personal life, which just shows, I think, that if you step out of line as a journalist, the incentives are such that you're going to be torched both personally and professionally. So that's why I think there's been a change in the last 5 to 10 years or so. And I would argue that really there's different cultural and social incentives that have made journalists really embrace their bias and have made it their allegiance to the Democrat Party a more central role of their professional lives. So with that, I think I want to talk a little bit about how the media handled COVID, because I think that that is a good example of how this dynamic has come about. Now, of course, the pandemic and the response to it was an earth-shattering event, but I would argue that it's a media-created event to a large extent. In many cases, you wouldn't really know that there was a pandemic unless you understood through the media that there was this thing being foisted upon us. Otherwise, you could go to the store, go out to eat, have normal interactions, and not really get the sense that there was some giant event taking place around us. And during COVID, the media was driven really by two things. Number one, to scare people, and number two, to blame Trump for everything that was going on. So rather than investigate empirical questions like how deadly is the virus, do masks work, is the vaccine safe and effective, will a lockdown stop the spread, instead, every single factual question was twisted through the lens of, is this good for Trump or bad for Trump? And that was where the reporting led, rather than where the facts were. And social media played a really interesting role here. Random professors and doctors grew large followings advocating for extreme public health measures on social media. Think people like Angie Rasmussen, Ellie Murray, and many others. Then mainstream media outlets, principally The Atlantic, but many others, would launder these kind of no-name extremists into being held up as experts by citing them as what the experts say in their articles. And then the public health so-called experts would point to these articles and say, well, the science is telling us this, we're just following the science, and so the cycle would go. And I think we're seeing a similar thing with this election, where extreme views are being laundered through the media to be held up as fact. There's that same kind of feedback loop dynamic at play here. And the reason for that is that Trump's policies are broadly popular, and only those with a vested interest in believing otherwise could honestly really say that America and the world was not better off when Trump was in office than when Biden and Harris are in office. So to get around this basic reality, I would say that the Democrats have created an alternate reality that forces Republicans to do double duty in trying to win this election. Not only do Republicans have to sell a positive vision for the future, but they also have to systematically refute every lie and hoax that's been perpetuated by the media. A good example would first be Biden's fitness to run for office. At first, it was a conspiracy theory that he was unfit until the debate happened, and that lie just became too impossible to sell anymore. You couldn't deny what had been apparent for months, that Biden lacked the ability to do the job. But even still, the media only focused on his fitness as a candidate. It was now acceptable to say that, okay, he can't run for office. But to this day, there's no broad media question of whether he's even fit to have the nuclear codes to oversee some of the most critical domestic and foreign events that are going on. That conversation still is not taking place. When Kamala was named as the successor, there was a manufactured narrative of joy and things like Kamala is brat that was never based on reporting as to what real people were saying on the ground. Rather, it was the media trying to work basically as a PR agent for the Democrat Party and sell a narrative of inevitability and success in hopes that that would have momentum of its own. Another example would be the way that the media has covered lawfare. This was a major misfire by the Democratic establishment. The unprecedented campaign of criminal indictments and civil fraud cases brought by the New York Attorney General and other such lawfare has actually, I would say, helped Trump in the polls, because the American people are smart enough to realize that this is fundamentally unfair, and they don't want a government that is weaponized to this extent. So, and people also recognize that someone who went their whole life in the public eye without really so much as a parking ticket is now suddenly the subject of 4 indictments with no victim or appreciable crime. And that strikes people as fundamentally unfair, which has forced the media to sort of pivot on their strategy here. So what they've done is really they've worked overtime to try to create the sense that Trump is some kind of monster in order to justify this gross abuse of prosecutorial power, which itself should be the story. For example, there was the New Republic cover that painted Trump as Hitler and had an entire issue fantasizing about how he would bring about a fascist takeover of the United States government, which to any thinking person is obviously absurd. Then we have the recent handling in the DC case, which I vehemently oppose calling the January 6th case, because Jack Smith could not legally bring any charges related to the riot. Instead, it's a concocted theory about some kind of vague fraud on the United States and a conspiracy against rights because of litigation related to elections and things like that. So with time running out, because the election is coming up, Judge Chutkan did something that I don't think any judge has ever done, which is given the prosecution carte blanche to put all of their evidence that they wish to introduce at trial in a public filing, basically a paper trial where there's no cross-examination, no rules of evidence, and no procedural safeguards whatsoever. And as we saw 2 days ago, there's not even a sealing of that order. It's now online for the entire world to see. And this allows Jack Smith to give basically all of his evidence to the media so that they can redo basically the January 6th committee's work, which fell flat in the media. People have moved on, They want to know about things that affect their real life. But once again, make the events of nearly 4 years ago the subject by allowing Jack Smith to give the media 185 pages of his side of the case and then allow the media to make this the cycle again. The media has also created this narrative whereby those perpetuating the lawfare, such as Jack Smith and the judges who have been pro-prosecution throughout all this, are somehow these beacons of justice, while constantly attacking Judge Cannon, who has been the only judge to really pump the brakes on this lawfare. For example, despite the fact that Judge Cannon has held hearings, put immense amount of thought and research into her orders, there's been a smear campaign against her, even sourcing from her law clerks and other judges in the courthouse to undermine the sense that her orders have legitimacy. So that's been really a media perpetrated hoax to undermine the way that case has fallen apart. So I think those are two real examples of how the media has taken what the facts on the ground are and perverted them in order to build a narrative against Trump that forces him to run not just against the Democrats' chosen candidate, but against the narrative that they've constructed. There's also been, as we've seen for years and years, hoax after hoax after hoax. For example, when President Trump held an event with Gold Star families at Arlington National Cemetery, rather than the story being the support that went both ways between these families and President Trump, the story was somehow one about whether he had the right paperwork and some sort of unknown but altercation that may have taken place, but that has no actual evidence or anything like that. So they take a story that would be a good story for him and through rumors and distortion try to make it a bad story. The current hurricane, of course, should be a bad story for the current administration, given how they've obviously bungled the response to it. But the front page of Politico on its website yesterday was about Trump's handling of wildfires years ago based on rumors of whether or not he wanted to give aid to this county or that county. Another example would be a fringe NGO filed a criminal case using this bizarre procedure in Ohio that allows private citizens to try to swear out criminal affidavits and then give them to the prosecutors. Media treats that as a fifth criminal case, despite the fact that any fringe group can go and swear out an affidavit and then it will be put in the trash can. So the campaign will have to work overdrive from day one and into the presidency, as we saw this is the same dynamic that took place while he was president, not just to sell his image, his brand, and his policies and what he wants for the country, but to spend 50% of his time unwinding each of these hoaxes and lies that the media is laundering against him. So I would say this has been a very pessimistic talk, but the one room for optimism that I see is that X, as well as Rumble and Substack, but I think especially X, has allowed this dynamic to unwind a little bit because it's allowed people who are not part of this media machine to have a large platform to tell the kind of stories that would otherwise have been suppressed in media. For example, if this were Elon Musk Twitter rather than Jack Dorsey Twitter in 2020 and the Biden laptop have come out, it wouldn't have been basically squashed out of existence until after the election. It would become the story that it was supposed to be, and we would have this avenue for the truth to get out despite the crushing weight of the media trying to put its thumb on the scales. So I do think that with the growth of independent media and free platforms like X and Rumble, as long as there are people that are willing to do investigative work and buck the trend, I think the mainstream media will try harder and harder to put its thumb on the scales, but its thumbs will get lighter and lighter over time. So that's my hope.
Well, Jesse, thank you very much. That was a very articulate presentation, as we expected from you. Very informative as well. And just as we segue to Bryan, yesterday on LinkedIn, I saw an undercover video clip of somebody interviewing one of the hosts of the MSNBC programs. And that host, I forgot his name, but he said point blank, we are trying to help Kamala Harris win the election. So everything we do is in support of her. He said basically those same words. So it's an interesting clip that is circulating now. Anyway, Bryan Blehm, we'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll try to keep it on point as much as possible. But I want to sort of use where he closed to talk about another point that I think is wholly valid, and that is that the media doesn't, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop. And whether or not the media used that to close the issue during the U.S. presidential campaign, and the way I'm going to sort of talk about the Hunter Biden laptop is that the United States media is not only sort of in league or alliance with the Democratic Party, they are also very much in league and alliance with those people that are basically running the national security state. And so when the Hunter Biden laptop issue became an issue, not only did the media work actively to try to you distance Biden from it and to make it appear to be a hoax, but with their alliance with the national security state, they didn't kill the story. What they did was they used the story to further advance this false narrative that somehow Donald Trump and Russia were in collusion. Right. You can go all the way back to when Donald Trump was elected originally in 2016. And what did the Democrats and the national security state do that entire presidency? They tried to impeach Donald Trump on the basis that he was somehow colluding with Russia. Well, if you go back to 2016, you know, Hillary Clinton was the original, what they're calling me now, election denier. And the media kept pushing out on behalf of Hillary Clinton, her statements and her, you know, evidence, if you want to call it that, that Russia actually defeated her in the 2016 election and not Donald Trump. And then we have a woman by the name of Susan Spalding, right? And a lot of people, not enough people talk about the organization I'm going to talk about right now, but it's key and central if you're going to talk about the media, especially social media in the United States. But Miss Susan Spalding, during the 2016 election, she was the undersecretary of the National Security Association during Barack Obama's presidency. She says in her own words, as she's watching the January 2021 swearing in of Donald J. Trump, that she was dismayed, right? And so what does Susan Spalding do, Undersecretary of the National Security Agency? After John Jay, her boss, unilaterally declared election infrastructure in the United States critical national security infrastructure. That gives the national security state the power to go in and basically seize our elections infrastructure, whether it be private companies like Runbeck Election Services that does so much work through the United States, or whether it be you know, our elections departments and their machines. But Susan Spalding created this organization known as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And this agency basically has a two-part component to it. And the two components, one is our election infrastructure, the machines. They get to probe our machines. They get to have people inside of Runbeck Election Services, our election departments. But the second component of that some people out on social media are talking about, I've been exceptionally vocal about the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is also known as CISA. But the second component of CISA was this language warfare, right? That they were waging war on the American people in order to stop what Susan Spalding called Russian disinformation in the U.S. media and primarily on social media. And so you get these stories then that are not just, quashed as far as Joe Biden is concerned during the 2020 election, but they're also then pushed and advanced against Donald Trump by the media in collusion with CISA, this cybersecurity organization created by Susan Spalding, right? And so if you're talking about what they refer to as mainstream media, CNN, NBC and all of these other organizations, what you have happening during this period of time in the run up to the 2020 election, if you look at COVID, and it reminded me of this article I had read out of Argentina about the Argentinian government and its relationship with the media. And basically, this study looked at the advertising revenues on a monthly basis in relation to front page corruption news stories against this very government. And so there's a relationship. As advertising revenues go down, naturally, front page stories about government corruption go down. And that's what this study found. And the same thing was taking place during COVID. And a lot of this money was pass-through money, right? You have the United States federal government in the run-up to COVID and all of these injections and jabs, passing billions of dollars to companies like Pfizer. And what did Pfizer do with billions of those dollars? Well, if you could not turn on mainstream media and watch for 2 minutes without seeing a Pfizer advertisement. So all of this money, whether it came out of Pfizer or the federal government, was being pumped into our media organizations. And so there's a direct correlation between the types of stories they were doing and the agenda they were advancing and what was taking place in, of course, U.S. politics. But you get to this Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and it plays a central role. This is the organization then that was working with Twitter, that was working with Facebook, that was working with all of the other social media companies to quash what it was labeling as Russian disinformation. And so the best example I like to use of this is a gentleman posted a video online about why he was walking away from the Democratic Party, Brandon Straka. And it became a thing. And so he created a movement called the Walkaway Movement. And Brandon Straka's Walkaway Movement took off like fire. You had a lot of people. He created the space in the internet where people could post videos then about why they were walking away from the Democratic Party. Well, Susan Spalding used her ties in the national security because she was Undersecretary of the National Security Agency. She had formerly been a Central Intelligence Agency attorney. She worked as an attorney for many of these Democrat-led committees in Congress that were actively working to impeach Donald Trump. And so you have this left-wing activist in the national security state of our government working in collusion with then social media companies. And they basically did everything in their power to label Brandon Straka and the Walkaway Movement as Russian disinformation, and essentially labeled this poor man a spy for doing nothing more than explaining to the world why he was leaving the Democrat reservation. And then other people followed suit, and this became a huge. She actually went into our judicial branch of government, and she used Brandon Straka as an example when educating our judiciary about Russian disinformation and free speech. And so the way I like to look at things is from sort of a structural perspective. You have this national security agency that's created basically to eliminate the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. It works very closely with media organizations to put forth an agenda, right? A national security agenda that is anti-Russia, anti-Russia, anti-Russia. very pro-Ukraine, pro-Ukraine, pro-Ukraine. And you have this agenda then that is used to attack people on social media. My wife had, 3 counts suspended from Twitter for doing nothing more than posting pictures of people at January 6th. My wife wasn't in DC on January 6th. She was simply sharing images of people that were. And so she's had 3 social media accounts removed, and somebody at X ought to restore her accounts because she was absolutely doing nothing wrong under U.S. law. But we've heard story after story after story about people who have been decimated, by this national security state. And the national security state is in bed with the Democratic Party leadership, and it's in bed with our media. They're basically controlling our media, and they're doing what they can to eradicate the First Amendment, because what their goal is to protect the image, right, of our constitutional institutions, when their goal should be to protect, the function of our constitutional institutions. And so when they're not functioning properly, we the people should be allowed to fix them. But thank God for Elon Musk purchasing X, and thank God for the rise, I guess, of social media, because it's given birth to a lot of people. Like here in Arizona, we have Rachel Alexander, and she's a journalist, media person that has a fairly large following, and she can get stories out that a lot of people in journalism can't get out today because they're precluded by their organization's leadership and hierarchy from doing those types of stories. So when we talk about media and its relationship with the Democratic Party and what it's doing, you can't talk about the media without first understanding this relationship that the media, the Democratic Party, have with this national security state after President Barack Obama left office in the United States. In fact, there was one government agent or one court case out of Missouri, the Western District of Louisiana. It was a state of Missouri versus Joseph R. Biden, and in that case, dealing with government censorship and Miss Spalding's CISA, the court said that the United States government seems to have assumed a role similar to an Orwellian ministry of truth. And it went on to argue that it arguably involves the most massive attack against free speech in United States history. And so as we talk about, media, we can't leave out this relationship to the national security state, because it's become ubiquitous. It's throughout every institution in American society, and it was only created in 2018, right? And so, you can read government records from judicial systems throughout the United States, and CISA has embedded itself in our state judiciaries. You can read emails and different things from local government elections departments. And CISA has embedded itself in our elections departments. And you can, try to get emails from, say, for example, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office out here in Maricopa County, Arizona, about their relationship with CISA. And they won't give anything to you, which to me tells me that they have a relationship with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So all of these institutions of our government, whether it be the Arizona Secretary of State or the Secretary of State from Louisiana or Missouri, all have ties to this new organization known as CISA that has embedded itself throughout our society, that works very closely with the media and is basically a talking point platform for the Democratic Party and its allies in the national security state. And so how much time do we have left that I can delve into?
10 minutes in total for this.
All right. And so there was also the subject of lawfare, right? And I've been, the subject of lawfare myself here in the state of Arizona, and as they say, the fight goes on, and as Trump said, fight, fight, fight. But CISA, and this is what sort of conservatives are fighting, whether you're a conservative lawyer or whether you're a conservative journalist. Basically, what we're fighting is CISA, because CISA and Susan Spalding, with a lot of these big national law firms, right? You've heard of Perkins Coie, I'm sure, and Perkins Coie's relationship with the Federal Bureau of Investigations. At one point they were actually sharing office space, which should sicken every one of Perkins Coie's clients. But you have the CISA embeds itself in the American Bar Association, and the American Bar Association then pushes stuff down to the local state bar associations, such that you even have the State Bar of Arizona, for example, telling law firms that they should allow CISA to probe their law firm systems to make sure they're secure, right? And so basically telling them that it's ethically permissible to allow the United States federal government into your law firm and into the potential for being able to access your client's sensitive data and information. But CISA and lawfare is everywhere. I've been was suspended for 2 months by the State Bar of Arizona in relation to the Lake v. Hobbs matter, because they say I sought to mislead or lie to the Arizona Supreme Court. And all we did was point out the fact that Katie Hobbs and her lawyers from, what's this guy's name? His name is Mark Elias, the Elias Law Group lawyers representing the Democrat Katie Hobbs, said that Maricopa County would know on the basis of these records that whether or not ballots were injected into the system. And so, we said, well, then it must be agreed, that everybody stipulates that 35,000 ballots were injected into the system, because that was the numerical difference between the two sets of documents they relied on. And so for that, I was suspended for 2 months. The State Bar crammed it through, pretty much as quickly as they could. And so working to reapply to get my license back right now. But lawfare is active. It's affecting anybody, and it's affecting everybody. And its aim is to, keep these stories as much as possible out of the news media. Because, one thing Lake v. Hobbs was, and I like to refer to Lake v. Hobbs, somebody told me this. They said Lake v. Hobbs was the most significant election-related litigation in the United States since Bush v. Gore. Right. And so Bush v. Gore, if you go back, you remember the hanging chads and everything, held in the balance in one little jurisdiction here in a Florida community where you had this chad that was hanging. Well, Lake v. Hobbs was significant in the sense that it educated the American public writ large. It wasn't just focused locally in the state of Arizona. It was focused nationally, because what you had take place after the 2020 election was this huge cover-up of information. For example, what hasn't the media talked about? The media hasn't talked about, I believe, the fact that Maricopa County's own records show that the county recorder in the 2020 election mailed 4 million plus mail-in ballots in Maricopa County alone. That's based on their own documents and records. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is there were only slightly over about 2.1 million registered voters in Maricopa County during that time. And so it's about hiding information from the public that lawyers would otherwise bring to the public in a judicial forum. But it's also about, ensuring that, the media people aren't going to cover any of these stories, because you have the national security state saying this is nothing more than Russian disinformation. But what happens when you send 4 million ballots to 2 million people? You have a lot of ballots flowing around that can then be added. And another story the media doesn't really talk about is after the election in 2020 in Maricopa County, more than 20,000 ballots were injected into the system. And so the media in Maricopa County simply regurgitate what the county tells them. Oh, the county already had those 20,000 ballots just laying around, and they just decided to deliver and process them after the election. Well, not a very plausible story when you're talking about, the environment that existed in the United States in 2020. And so lawfare is not just about attacking people like Donald Trump, and suing him to make him look bad in the public's eyes so that, Kamala Harris can win this presidential election. It's about attacking the very core and the very roots. It's about attacking small attorneys like myself. I'm a sole practitioner. They want to take my license. And one of the reasons they want to take my license is I do a lot of work for one of the most successful election integrity organizations in the United States. It's known as We the People Arizona Alliance. And so I do a lot of work for them, and that work involves suing Maricopa County, getting their election-related materials, and then broadcasting those to members of the Arizona legislature and to the public at large, using whatever social media or media influences or tools that we have available to us. And so lawfare is this bigger beast than just focusing on Donald Trump. It focuses on everybody who will bring election-related challenges on behalf of Donald Trump or pro-MAGA candidates. And it affects all of those attorneys that are doing election integrity work and broadcasting this information publicly, because it really pretty much embarrasses our government with respect to how they're actually running our elections and what's happening. And so, lawfare is something that I've felt very deeply, and I still feel to this day. And so I don't know if that covers the points adequately, but we could do a whole month of your show on nothing more than CISA, who created it, why it was created, and what it has done since 2018, and how detrimental it is to constitutional governance in the United States of America.
Well, Bryan, thank you for opening our eyes in terms of CISA. It's something that many of us were not aware of at all, and it's a very nefarious operation. How nefarious is it? So even if a presidential candidate is able to overcome all of these hurdles, for example, if Donald Trump's able to overcome all of these hurdles and he wins the popular vote, the electoral vote, could CISA overturn some of the elections in states with the electors and deny him the office again?
Well, that's an interesting point, and as everyone should already know, because there have been some social media stories about it, members of Congress and the Democratic Party have been very openly talking about what their plans are should Donald Trump win, and that is January 6th, right? So their plans are at January 6th, if he wins the election, to deny him the electoral county votes that he needs to win. Now, you don't see CISA nearly as much as you see the FBI doing the Democratic Party's bidding, because the FBI has basically become the Stasi, the German secret police, and under the old Soviet system when you had East and West Germany. And so the FBI is about as corrupt as they come right now. I don't think it's ever reached this level of corruption in its existence. But you get basically what's happening is the national security state has deemed January 6th a national security day. right? They've hijacked our elections at the federal level, our infrastructure, right? So they can control it all. They have a say in it. And they've hijacked speech. And now they've hijacked January 6th. So the national security state has already announced that the national security state is going to basically lock down Congress on January 6th, which if I'm a conservative congressman and I'm going to the halls of Congress on the morning of January 6th, I would go in feeling like I'm being held hostage by a national security state that will very heavily, my guess is, militarize Congress, as we see happened after January 6th, 2021. Right. And so you're going to get this militarization of the people's house of government. And so they could do anything they want, but they overthrew the government of Donald Trump in 2020. And this is when they have to consolidate power. If we win and Donald Trump's allowed to take the White House, they will never consolidate power. We will be able to root the people out in what they have done to our constitutional system of government. And they can't stand for that, which is why, I don't think we've seen the last assassination attempt against Donald Trump. There will be another attempt, and which is why they will do everything, including hijack our system on January 6th, where the people will not be allowed to be present. Also, very interesting, Arizona is the state that refused to say, oh, yeah, we'll just trust our bureaucrats and let them tell us who won our elections and who didn't. Arizona has been fighting since 2020, actually going back to 2018. And so it's been leaked that the Federal Bureau of Investigations will have a very big presence in Maricopa County during the upcoming elections. And so what a lot of us believe they're setting the stage for is to have a lot of people like Ray Epps. I'm sure your viewers are familiar with Ray Epps and the role he played in January 6th, and the fact that the federal government is hiding what he actually did on their behalf during January 6th. But they plan to bring, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations has basically responded by saying, oh, we have no plans to have armed officers in your polling places, right, on election day. And so what does that mean? Well, they plan to have a whole bunch of unarmed officers in our polling places, and they plan to have a significant number of agitators on the ground in our polling locations in Maricopa County, Arizona. And what a lot of us believe they're setting the stage for is they want somebody to get violent, and so they can come in, they can take over our elections. They've already very heavily militarized the elections department downtown. But that would give them then the excuse and justification to come into Maricopa County, shut down our elections, remove the people from the process, which, as you recall, was critical in the 2020 coup. Covering the windows with pizza boxes, kicking people out of the election departments, and then counting ballots in secret. And that's, my guess is that's what their plan is for Maricopa County, so then they can announce the winner of Arizona's elections, and we will just have to sit down and shut up. And their people working for them in the media will just parrot whatever they're supposed to parrot, right? One thing that hasn't been brought up yet is Project Mockingbird. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Project Mockingbird. That's when the Central Intelligence Agency was basically taking over U.S. media and having the U.S. media run stories on its behalf, something that's illegal in the United States of America, but they're doing the exact same thing now. And so if you look at that period of time, the 60s, the 70s, the anti-war movement, the CIA was having the media and protesters doing anti-war protesters, pro-war protests. And this was all paid for by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Okay. Just one more quick question, and I promise that our next gentleman will have a good bit of time to speak as well. Within 2 minutes, maybe, what role could Kamala Harris play as vice president, tiebreaker in the Senate, to deny Donald Trump the presidency if he deservingly wins the election?
Well, basically, the way the process works is it's a vote, by state, as opposed to, the individual members don't simply cast a vote to choose the new president if nobody, and this only applies if nobody wins a majority of the electoral votes, then it's thrown to the Congress, and they would vote then by state. And so we have a 50 state system, so feasibly you could get a 25 and 25. Not very likely, but what's likely to happen is the national security state is going to try to play a significant role in ensuring that a majority of states swing their electoral votes away from Donald Trump and to Kamala Harris. And so I don't think if Kamala Harris were a tie-breaking vote, I think America would probably be in complete uproar and immediate civil war at that point. And so that would be too obvious. So I don't think that's what they're setting the stage for.
Okay, great. That was an excellent session, very informative, both two very articulate speakers. So we really appreciate Bryan Blehm speaking to us and Jesse Franklin-Murdock speaking on the topic of mainstream media subservience to the Democrat Party. So let's go into the next session. We had a nice segue from Bryan. Next session is lawfare.